So here we are at the final session of a very rich day. We started off with Ben giving us his president's address this morning. He asked us, where are we now? What do we want to achieve? And how do we get there? Well, being osteopaths, we're all going to get there together, but we're going to use very different paths. And that's what we're going to talk about now. What are these paths? Let's pin down something specific. Let's make some decisions so that we make progress. As Linda Hindle showed us this morning, there are many opportunities. There are national opportunities, there are local opportunities, and we all need to be leaders. It's extraordinary. A year ago, Suzanne Rastrick, who is Chief Allied Health Professionals Officer, stood here and talked about being AHPs. And for me, it was like she was describing another country. I couldn't quite get my head around what this opportunity might give us. But now, we've moved on significantly during this year, and Linda was talking about being part of the AHP family, and I really do feel part of the AHP family, but this needs developing. We need concrete, definite decisions and ways of travelling. So over the next hour, let's pull out some take-home messages. What practical changes can we put in place? Or even if we don't put them in place, what can we start working on? Because these sorts of things take a long time to develop. So we have three experts here to guide our thinking and comment on the past, the present, and the future. Simon Fielding, as you know, Simon Fielding OBE, was very significant in the campaign for the legal recognition of osteopathy. He is known as the architect of the UK Osteopaths Act 1993, and then he was the first GOSC chair, so he's a highly well-informed and significant person. Jonathan is a different highly well-informed and significant person. He is a man of many talents. He has been a medical doctor, a university academic, and chair of a large mental health trust. And he's particularly good at looking at whole systems approaches to healthcare and pulling out strategic and holistic solutions. Maurice, I really don't feel I need to introduce. If you want to know more about Maurice, you should ask him, but I feel we all know Maurice quite well. So let's start off with Simon and hear what Simon has to say about how do we get there.
Thank you, Susan, very much. And sorry, yes, it was my fault. So when we look back at the long campaign for statutory recognition of the profession, I think it's important that it's viewed in the context of the prevailing environment in which the profession was operating at the time. When I went into practice back in the late 1970s, the position of the profession was very different to the one that we enjoy today. For example, there were barely 700 osteopaths on the old GCRO, General Council Register of Osteopaths register, and there were 6 other competing registers, much smaller, all who were particularly hostile to the GCRO. And apart from the 3 main schools that were offering 4-year full-time training, there was a plethora of other courses offering training in osteopathy, which varied from 2 or 3 years of weekend training all the way through to a few weekends training in manipulation. And indeed, anybody could, irrespective of their training, could set up practice as an osteopath, put up their plaque, and call themselves an osteopath. So the public were very confused, and clearly this did nothing for the professional standing of the profession in the wider community, and particularly the medical profession, considered us by and large as being sort of fringe alternative practitioners. Makes you quite nostalgic, really. But it wasn't only patients that found it difficult. I think that the profession itself was imploding in itself. And of course, back in those days, our fees also were subject to VAT, and making it harder to compete with professions like physiotherapy And the enmity that existed within the different groups meant that news media like the BBC or other news outlets were very reluctant to cover any story on osteopathy because they knew it was going to cause an awful ruckus within the profession. So when I entered practice in 1997, I was blissfully ignorant of all this, but quickly became aware of the challenges that were facing the profession. And I resolved to try and help to do something about it. The prevailing view of the profession then was, well, we tried getting statutory recognition back in the 1930s. Well, that didn't work, so no point trying it again. And indeed, that was the view of officials at the Department of Health, who after 3 years of badgering them, finally granted me a meeting to discuss the regulation of osteopathy. And they basically told me, well, the profession is fragmented, there's no proper standards, there's no parliamentary support for such a measure, and indeed the medical profession would fiercely oppose it. So, no chance. And being told that something's impossible has always been a bit of a red rag to a bull to me. So I spent a fair bit of time looking at the legislation of other countries in the English-speaking world, and also what the current structures of regulation of healthcare professions were in the UK. And it quickly became clear that the option of the profession coming under the Professions Supplementary to Medicines Act, which in those days regulated physiotherapists, lab technicians, dietitians, etc., wasn't suitable. Partly some of those professions themselves are trying to get out from underneath the PSM Act, but it wasn't suitable for an emerging profession, and it certainly wouldn't provide any protection of title, so patients wouldn't be a lot better off. So the only solution, therefore, was to seek independent statutory recognition of osteopathy along the lines of the Medicine and Dental Acts. And this, of course, needed parliamentary support. So in 1986, that didn't work. Neither did that. Do I have to aim it somewhere? Oh, I do love aviators. No, not that. Right, that'll do. Right. In 1986, in order to raise awareness of the case for osteopathic legislation within Parliament, we got an MP, Roy Galley, to introduce a 10-minute rule bill. And that's basically, he just stands up for 5 minutes and says, I think osteopathy should be regulated, blah, 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 blah. And they go, oh, here, blah, blah. And then basically, it's an order to be printed. It doesn't go any further. There's no debate, really. It has no chance of becoming law. But it did raise the issue of legislation for osteopaths for the first time since the 30s. And it did mean that we had a bill printed. We put together information packs that were sent to many, many osteopaths up and down the country, telling them how to visit their MPs and to seek their support for future legislation. And the message was simple. It was more and more patients are consulting osteopaths. Osteopaths exist, but patients have the right to know that the people they consult are properly trained, safe, competent, and properly regulated. And the campaign was a huge success, way above expectation. Virtually every MP that was asked said, yeah, we'll support that. So we had over 300 MPs pledging their support for future legislation, which was a big first step. Then we turned our attention to the medical profession, and numerous meetings over many years were held with the presidents of the Royal Colleges of Medicine, the General Medical Council, the British Medical Association. It was actually the BMA who, incidentally, back in the 1930s, fiercely opposed the 4 attempts at osteopathic legislation. Interestingly, on the basis that any legislation to recognise osteopathy would severely affect the income of doctors. Like a good bit of protectionism. Anyway, but that was called pre-national health. So they were in private practice as well. The ultimate outcome of all the discussions with the medical profession was that the bastions of the medical profession did all say that they would support legislation to regulate the practice of osteopathy. The next essential piece was to demonstrate the wider degree of support amongst people like community health councils and the public at large and other healthcare professions that we could get for legislation. And so with the help of the persuasive powers of His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, the King's Fund, which is the foremost medical think tank in the UK, was persuaded to sponsor a working party on osteopathy under the adroit chairmanship of Judge Sir Thomas Bingham, who then was Master of the Rolls. And the working party's remit was to consult widely, as wide as possible, on the proposed legislation to recognise and regulate the profession and to produce a draft bill. And this was the report that they, after 2 years' work, was produced in 1991. And it was very enthusiastically received by all the different interested parties, and particularly ministers who felt, well, actually, this is something that we can start to put our weight behind. And then the Lord Walton, who was the past chairman of the General Medical Council and indeed was past chairman of the BMA and himself a working party member, he introduced the Osteopaths Bill to Parliament, to the House of Lords. And it went through several readings in the House of Lords, and it achieved overwhelming cross-party support. But then, before it had chance to enter the House of Commons, disaster struck when the then Prime Minister, John Major, got a touch of the wobbles, and he called an election. So the Osteopaths Bill, along with all the other bills in process within Parliament, fell. And that was potentially the death knell of the Osteopaths Bill for some while, because any new government would have such a busy legislative agenda. There was, it seemed at that point, little chance of it being able to be resurrected in a new Parliament. So something had to be done to keep the momentum and keep the issue alive in the minds of politicians. So I sent this cartoon on a Christmas card to parliamentarians in both houses, and you can see it's the Palace of Westminster in snow, and someone's saying, "What about the Osteopaths Bill? Pay it, pay it." This struck a chord, and from the feedback, it brought some amusement to various members of our upper house and lower house at Christmas time. In fact, the minister later commented that she thought it demonstrated the profession not only had a sense of humour, but it also had maturity and the confidence not to take itself too seriously. So following the Christmas recess, meetings were held with ministers and officials at the Department of Health, and after many, many discussions, we finally got the assurance that if the Osteopaths Bill could be reintroduced by means of a private member's bill, then the government, extraordinarily, would give it full government support. And that's pretty rare. So fortunately, again, Lady Luck was on our side, because one of our strong supporters in the House of Commons, Malcolm Moss MP, came second in the ballot for private members. And it's usually only the first three MPs who come first, second and third have any chance of getting a bill read, let alone passed. And he jumped at the chance of taking on a bill that had promised to have government support, because basically it would be treated like a government bill. Now, little did he know when he took it on, poor chap, that the Osteopaths Bill would end up being the longest and most complex piece of legislation ever to be enacted by means of a private members. So he was working nights quite a lot. But while there were many, many adrenaline-filled moments through the passage of the bill through both houses of Parliament, it eventually received its royal assent on the 1st of July, 1993. And there it is in all its glory. So osteopathy had finally achieved the recognition it had long deserved and was granted the same legal status as the professions of medicine and dentistry. Because once the Act was on the statute book, then the real hard work began. It took over 2 years of consultation by the Cabinet Office Appointments Board to appoint the first 23 members of the lay members and professional members of the first General Osteopathic Council. And here they all are in their glory. And the observant of you will see our president-to-be, second from the right there. And a lovely fresh-faced lot they look. And as you'll also notice, we're all drinking wine, which might possibly explain some of the early policy decisions we made. Anyway, then with the help of an initial grant from the Department of Health, we began work on securing funding, which was no mean feat, finding an office, engaging staff, and then bringing in commencement orders to bring different sections of the Act into force. And then finally, we opened the statutory Register of Osteopaths. So, Was it all worth it, I hear you say? Well, not surprisingly, having spent the amount of time I did on it, I would have to say, yes, I think it was. Certainly, the old divisions that existed in the profession, with the disparate standards and the distension, etc., would be totally untenable in today's ever-increasing sort of post-Shipman and litigious world. So yes, in that sense, it was a necessity. But have we made the most of the opportunities that statutory recognition could afford us? Well, we have a united profession. The title osteopath is protected. Patients have proper safeguards. Education standards have been harmonised. And there's also greater awareness of the profession, both within the general public and within the other healthcare professions. And there's no VAT on our fees. But could we have done more? Well, back then in the midst of time when the statutory register opened, I said, but what of the future? What is certain is that we cannot rest on our laurels. Statutory recognition is about the possibilities for the future. We have a great opportunity to develop the full potential of osteopathy and tangibly demonstrate the real value of osteopathic healthcare. And this message had been previously voiced by the Minister of Health, Baroness Cumberledge, who actually said, I'm aware of the benefits of osteopathic treatment extend beyond the realms of back pain. Ongoing research will therefore play an important role in enabling osteopathy to realise its full therapeutic potential. That's not bad from a Minister of Health, really. But this view was, from the Minister, was really a reflection on the mood within the House of Commons and through committee stage and in the House of Lords. As it was quite clear that they wanted to leave, they didn't want to prescribe the scope of osteopathic practice within the Act, and it's not defined. There's no definition of osteopathy or osteopathic practice in the Act, because they wanted to give the profession the freedom of self-determination to develop the profession in whatever way we determined. Now, it's no criticism at all of any of the groups like NCOR, the schools, GOSC, IO, but there are, I think, a couple of areas where we could probably do more. The first, of course, is research that will support clinical practice. And the second is that we need to do more to reach out to those sections, the majority of the public, that do not access osteopathic healthcare. And it's not too late, but it needs the profession to support the efforts with the same energy, enthusiasm and determination that we showed in getting our Act. Just think how quickly we could develop a convincing evidence base if half the profession, just half of us, collected the outcome data from our patients. And it's something we all need to do. The future is in our hands. And my colleagues here are going to tell you a little bit about how that's all going to happen. Thank you very much.
I'd start with a couple of words of comfort listening to Simon. I was a GP for 10 or 15 years, and the journey that you're going on is one that's very similar to the journey that general practice went on, albeit a little while ago. So there was a charter first, and then a sort of organisation of what was a very disparate set of people into coming together, and the various other things in terms of the GP contract and so on and so forth. And you've got a much more coherent workforce in some other crises at the moment. But it's, if it's any reassurance, this is a generic journey that any disparate group trying to get together is obliged to go on, and I think you're making really good progress. I'm going to talk a bit about the snapshot that I took when I first joined. First question would be, why here and why now? And in essence, it's a coincidence, but I became chairman of the Osteopathic Foundation at a time when the IO was revisiting its strategy and thinking about the future. And that was really because there seemed to be a number of things in the air, a sort of tipping point in terms of where we stood, the number of people who are doing osteopathy, the environment in which we were working, and actually there was a sense that, not a cliff, but we need to prepare for the future. Why me? Well, again, I come as an outsider, and I should issue a health warning at this stage, because I'm not in any of the groups. Please take what I say in the spirit intended, and don't take offence if your particular specialty you feel a bit prickly about it. So apologies in advance. But I know quite a lot about healthcare, and I know quite a lot, because of that, about change management. And the fact that I am an outsider allows me to say things that perhaps are well known inside, but perhaps can't be expressed from inside the church. You need someone from the outside to talk about it. Okay, so the metaphor of the church is actually not inappropriate, because it feels as if osteopathy is a very broad church, with a very, on one side, the people who are very strong believers in Andrew Stills, and who follow what might say the gospel according to Stills very closely. And at the other end of that spectrum are the people where you might typify as physio plus. So it's much more physical, it's much more about prescription, it's much more joint orientated, it's much less about the sort of holistic nature that osteopaths typify. And there's every place in between. And that's not a criticism, it's just an observation. It's very organic, and in the sense that it's, as I said, a bit like general practice, coming together lots of a very disparate group of people who are not used to working with each other, and as a sense, working in either as individuals or as very small groups. So the individual, the importance of my practice is far more important to me as an osteopath than the wider community. And if you want to make progress, that balance, the balance between self and other, needs to change to make progress. And when you talk to someone who's working on their own, why should they? What's in it for them? And that's really one of the key things in change management. You have to find ways of disrupting people's status quo because it feels important to them to do it. Not because you tell them to, they won't do it then. It's about how you create almost a slightly disruptive feel that says, well, I have to change. I want to change. There are either good or bad reasons why I need to change. And that's really how you begin to get that very disparate group more together. So the idea of herding cats isn't a criticism again. It's about the fact that you don't have a common incentive. There's no way. General practice used to be very much around herding cats, but now you herd them with money. You herd them with terms and conditions. So there need to be, you have to find a common currency in order to make change happen. One of the other very strong observations I made early on is it feels very altruistic, that people don't go into osteopathy to make pots and pots of money. They're doing the right thing. So Osteopathy Inc., it ain't. It doesn't feel like a big, massive corporation. And again, that's not a criticism. I think you need to hang on to that. It's changed even in the 18 months I've been involved. So when I started, it felt as if the high and low churches were really quite disparate. And there was quite a lot of mutual antipathy and defensiveness between the different groups. I think that's changed. I'm not quite sure why, whether that's sense of crisis, whether it's the work of the IO, but there's much less talk about the different factions and much more sense of global osteopathy needing to move forward. And again, I want to hang on to that because I'll come back to that in a minute. A brief word about the IO and GEOSC. That, again, I wasn't here when it felt like us and them, but I gather that a few years ago it was very strongly they were there as the regulators and the IO was there to defend osteopaths against GEOSC. It doesn't feel like that anymore, and I think that's a lot about the two chief execs working together, and the whole mood seems to have changed quite a lot. So it's developmental, it's a collaboration, it's trying to do things to move the profession forward. But there's a word of caution there. Tim is leaving relatively soon, and we don't know who's going to replace him. And there's also talk about whether the future of regulation of the allied health professions more generally. And the talk until a few months ago was that we would have an overall regulator. That seems to be changing now because the government is so preoccupied with other matters across the water. There's also a plethora of different working groups, and the TLAs, the three-letter acronyms, or the four-letter acronyms in some cases, are too many for me to remember. But they are of variable effectiveness, and I think, again, there's something about trying to get their purpose more sorted, which is beginning. Looking at the education, again, it's unusual. Most people who go into general practice, there's a fairly steady path and they end up as GPs by the time they're 28 or 30. You've got a really interesting mixture of younger and more mature undergraduates. And quite a lot of people do it as a second career. And I've heard several people say this thing about bankers become chiropractors and it's the hippies that become osteopaths. So the sense of chiropractic being much more business focused, profit focused, getting people into the system, the gravy train, is much stronger than it is with osteopathy. And I would say that's a criticism of chiropractic, but it's also an observation that we need to be a bit more businesslike. We need to think about keeping the bottom line going, and actually, like the shark, you need to move forward to survive. But because of this mixture, and particularly once you've got a family and a mortgage to support and so on, the sort of hunger, the ambition and the entrepreneurialism that you expect from a 25-year-old may not be there in a 45-year-old. And so that may be an issue for how we move the profession forward. There are lots of different schools and colleges, and frankly, I don't know how they all survive. And I think there is a stage coming where we'll need to think about different ways of working, whether it's amalgamation, whether it's collaboration, whether it's cooperation. That's not for me to say. But it's something, there's a challenge of working together and keeping the USP of all the different colleges because there aren't enough students to support the colleges as they now stand. Hopefully we'll get more graduates, because I think one of the things we'll talk about later is expansion and growth. But at the moment, I think it's not going to survive the way it is. As far as the public is concerned, and lots of people have said it even today, it's curiously invisible. So, as we heard Ben say this morning, very few people use it. 10% have ever used it, 2% use it in 1 year, but the satisfaction rate is in the high 90s. So people who use it like it, and that's really important. And that leads on to, well, how do you measure its impact? And people tend to get bogged down in the medical model of research, which is a randomized control trial is the only way of doing things. And I come from a medical background, and so that was my starting point. I've done quite a lot of organizational research where you can't do randomized control trials. And I've become an advocate of mixed methods, of doing lots of different ways of measurement. You do need to do the research, there's no doubt about that. But there's something around not worrying too much about what's in the box, whatever the box is you're examining, but looking at its impact. And I'd suggest that the way forward for osteopathy, and it also helps to cover the different churches, the different ways of working, is not to be worried too much about what's inside the osteopathy box, but say, well, what is its impact? What does it do for people at work? What does it do for patient satisfaction? What does it do for particular diseases, if you like? But not worrying, well, is it when I press with my left hand or my right hand, or when I give them an exercise or whatever? That almost comes later. Let's look at the gestalt of the whole thing, and then we might be able to move it forward. Because at the moment, there's, again, a slightly curious, from my research background, reluctance to get involved in the research. The PROMS thing isn't being used by enough people. There's a lot more that could be done. And again, I guess it's about, well, why should I? What's in it for me? Is it going to either damage or help me? And perhaps even an implicit slight sense of threat. Well, if I begin to measure, I may find I'm not being as effective as I think I am. Now, I think there's a belief there that we are doing good. It's a question of demonstrating it and not being scared of looking at it. So I think that's really important. At the moment, we're outside the NHS, and again, that's a challenge. Should we be in? Should we be out? How does that work? And it's a mixed blessing, because actually, the therapeutic impact of paying is quite an important one and shouldn't be messed about with. And particularly in times when there's austerity, whatever Mrs. May says, it's quite helpful to the government to have something that isn't free, that can be outside the Exchequer's control, and that's an argument for being outside. At the same time, if you want to be part of the family, if you want to be part of the egalitarianism that is the NHS, then you want to feel in it and part of it. But you'll only get into it if you can demonstrate value for money. At the moment in particular, the NHS isn't going to spend money just for the sake of spending. But if you can show a return on investment, that is a way forward. If you show that for every pound that is spent, you can save so much in terms of time at work, time off work, or whatever it is, that may be a way forward. Okay, where have I got to? So, as we move forward, what are the challenges, if you like, from my perspective, and this is my segue into Morif. I suggest that you need to clarify and simplify the brand so that people out there understand what we mean by osteopathy, not in a number of different paragraphs, but in an elevator pitch, in a few words that says, this is what we do. It doesn't matter whether I'm cranial or pediatric or whatever, this is what I do. And I think being clear about that is really helpful. Not just for our own sake, it gives us a sense of credo, a belief system, but more importantly for the outside world, that we can go out there and people get a better understanding of what's happening. Then I think you need to strengthen that with the evidence we've been talking about, whether it's effectiveness, efficiency, or cost. And don't worry too much about what outcomes, but look for outcomes. So they can be physical, they can be social, they can be psychological, but we do need to have some outcomes-based research. What is the impact of what we're doing? And how we do that, whether it's a controlled trial or just numbers, doesn't really matter. We can work on that. We need to agree, it may be that we need to agree to disagree, how we interact with the NHS. It may be there isn't one model, but at the moment we're working very much on the edges. We heard a talk today about how being incorporated as an AHP, but without any really clear picture of what that means in terms of working with the other professions, and particularly the non-manual therapy professions, the nurses, the OTs, the SALTs. But even with physios and chiropractors, how does that work? I've been very impressed with OSCA and the way that they bring together the physios, the chiropractics, and the osteopaths at the Olympics. And there may be models of mixed methods in even the way we deliver our care. So are we core or are we peripheral? Are we in or out? How are we going to take the profession forward? And then we need to tune the training and the research to match those. So once we've decided where it is we're going, then the training, the education needs to match that, and with it the CPD and the continuing development, which is also vitally important. And the final point I'd make is that you need to grow to survive. There aren't enough osteopaths. It's not sustainable as it is, I'd suggest. The need is growing, the want is growing. Our challenge is to make it grow with it. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have no idea who I am because I've been introduced yet. Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to talk about the future, at least attempt to. I want to start basically, I suppose, by acknowledging, I think, where the Simons and his merry crew of the world has actually taken us over the last 25 years, because I think particularly as we are now also helping to look after the European Federation Forum of Osteopathy, it's become clearer and clearer that the journey that we've been through in the last 25 years is one which a lot of our European colleagues is also going through. And the interesting thing is that not only are their journeys very similar to ours, but actually as a result of what we've been going through and of various other initiatives like the SEN standard and so on, the process of acknowledgement of osteopathy as a valuable health profession is accelerating, which is great. I would, however, argue that, as I've been arguing with my colleagues across Europe, that regulation isn't the end point, it's the start point of recognition. Because it's not just about having a law, it's actually about embedding osteopathy where it deserves to be, and I would guess where it needs to be, which is actually very much at the heart of a nation's healthcare. And at the moment, we ain't nowhere close, excuse my French. 2% every year of adults come to see an osteopath, 10% penetration after 105 years are not great statistics. Slightly failing student numbers is kind of worrying. So those are the sort of questions that I want us to chew over. But I'd also like to look, again, back at the past and think about how we've achieved what we have achieved. What Simon was talking about was the process of actually bringing together a very competitive and fragmented profession back in the 70s, and actually bringing it together at least into a single force which delivered the act. I would actually argue that, unfortunately, in the intervening 25 years, we kind of took a foot off the pedal. We kind of thought we have the act, we have a regulator now, recognition is ours, we've done it. And we sat back for most of the last quarter of a century and thought, well, when's it coming then, whatever it is? And it's not quite happened yet, which is all to do with access, it's all to do with recognition, and we're not there yet. So the first 5 years last 5 years, since I've been in post, we've had a new strategy for the IO. And it's been about actually trying to get back to the days of collaboration, cooperation. It's a journey that, in fact, I didn't start. It's actually Tim, my predecessor, and others across the profession that in 2012 already started to talk about coming together. And they did. ODG was one of the outcomes of that. And it's worked. If ODG's proven one thing, it's the fact that actually osteopaths can work together and play nice and actually deliver good outcomes and results. And I think ODG has been one of the key reasons why in March last year we were invited by NHS England to become allied health professionals. Because actually we were proving over and over again that we were not a set of fragmented organizations pretending to be a profession. We actually were a profession that could work together. So just think about the power of unity and the power of actually working together, because I think that's what's actually got us here, led by good folk like Simon and others. And I'd like to take that as a key theme for how we need to start to move going forward. So that's why in January this year, when we sat down and thought, well, what's the next 5-year strategy that the Institute of Osteopathy needs to put together? Where are we going with all of this? I think we just basically decided that we'd got, by that time, 5 years of building under our belts a collaborative working relationship with GEOSC. So in January this year, when actually preparing for our new 5-year plan, we actually wanted to do it with everyone else, with all the other collaborators. So in January 2018, we sat down, 55 of us. There were about 20 stakeholder organizations, including regional societies, and just individuals who had great ideas and dedication. And we threw them a challenging question, which is, how do we create a growing and sustainable future for UK osteopathy, for UK osteopaths? And we did emphasize growing and sustainable. We've lobbed numbers at you, 2%, 10%, slow growth, and in fact, decline in student numbers, and so on and so forth. So they're all signs of a profession that is not really yet thriving and growing quickly. So how do we change it? What we created from that was an idea for a vision for the long-term future, because what we thought we'd do is, rather than to say, where do we want to get to in 5 years' time, is where do we want to get to ideally, full stop? And this vision could be 20 years out, it could be 60 years out. Hopefully it's actually only 10 to 15 years out. We're starting to build an idea of what the future for UK osteopaths should actually look like, as a vision that perhaps we can all start to work towards. It's designed around, I suppose, 3 major legs, arms, strategies, call it what you will. At the center of it, we've got a call sign, a sort of call to action, which is liberating osteopathy for the nation's health. The 3 legs of this stool are, as we've talked about before, universal access, universal recognition, and a growing and thriving profession. And it starts to branch out from there within each of those 3 legs of the stool. On recognition, for example, we're talking about high professional standards, which help that, informed clinical practice, which help that, a strong cohesive brand, which will help it if we ever had one, and professional respect and awareness, which we think we've got, but it's a low level. On universal access, we want to work with all of health. That's a statement. How, we don't yet know, but this is not about the how, this is where we want to try and get to. Broad and affordable access to osteopathy by all strata of society, absolute must. Under a growing, thriving profession, we want to build flexible career pathways. One of the projects, by the way, the ODG embarked on starting 5 years ago was called Career Development. Matthew, poor Matthew, was actually tasked with mapping osteopathic careers. I think it took about 4 minutes, because leave a college, buy slate, put slate on wall was kind of it. Lifelong learning is another aspect of growing and thriving profession. So it's not just about the new GEOS scheme. It's about a profession that believes in continuous development of itself, both individually and collectively as a profession. Effective leadership. It doesn't mean being bossed. It doesn't mean letting GEOS take over. It doesn't mean letting IO take over. But that's actually about the fact that we have leaders throughout the profession who do things, do development things, do new things. A number of you in this room I know have been through the ODG leadership program. And I think we've had 3 cohorts now. And I think good results. What's always stunned me is that the key takeout from the sort of 4 months of study, there were sort of 2 full days which bookended the distance learning, was kind of the sort of dawning realization that actually none of you needed permission to lead. You just needed to know you had it already. So if you've got an idea, work with it. Tonight, for example, at the IO annual awards, we will look at even more very good examples of people who are leading because they're demonstrating how actually osteopathic ideas will work, can work, and deliver great results for patients. And also thriving businesses. At the end of the day, we are not about, as I think some people have said to me, the IO is going to flush the profession down the toilet of the National Health Service, which doesn't have any money. It's not. We are at the moment in a position where most of us are in private practice, only 2% of us actually work inside the National Health Service. They don't have money to give us 5,400 employment contracts tomorrow. Actually, having said which, did you realize that 12% of physio jobs go unfilled? There aren't enough physiotherapists. And actually, I got a wonderful call. I got a complaint last week. I'm going to tell you about a complaint I got last week. Last week I got a complaint from the Deputy Director of Healthcare and Wellbeing at a trust in Essex. What she complained about was that she couldn't get enough osteopaths to apply for jobs in her trust. She wanted us to help. We're very pleased to help. In fact, we're going to carry her ads for free for forever. But she was desperate to get osteopaths to work in her trust because she knows how we work and she wants more of us. And she can't get us to apply for jobs. So there's a complaint that we're going to be very happy to deal with. And the great thing is she's also going to write an article in an OT about how other trusts you can approach for more work and so on and so forth. So, part of it is actually opening up the NHS to start to benefit us, I suppose, as a profession in the way that it already needs to, which is that we have highly experienced clinical experience that we can already bring into the National Health Service. There are lots of gaps as well, lots of programs we need to work with. So I say that's a vision for the sort of future that we believe that the profession deserves to go for. Now, does this look like a vision worth working for? Anyone say no? So can I take it as a broad yes? Do we have consensus in the room? Yes. Excellent. Thank God for that, okay. Right, so that's what we're heading for. So therefore, the sole remaining task is, what do we do in the next 5 years? Well, just before we go there, I just wanted to reassure some of those who had any doubt. The principles that we have been working on in developing the profession, in working towards the development of the profession over the last 5 years, as the IO, are about, we build osteopathy as one profession. We build and support broad career choice. Your choice, not ours. We're trying to create broader ranges of career choice for everyone, from those who've been in practice 4 minutes to those who've been in practice 40 years or more. We want to build on osteopath's scope of practice, which, thank you, Simon, has not been defined or restricted, not to limit it. And dare I say it, even our early attempts to define specialist practice is actually part of that journey. Don't read us wrong. We are not about trying to confine the profession. And we build collaboration, A, between osteopaths, and B, between osteopaths and other health professions. Because that issue around fragmentation is not just fragmentation between osteopathic institutions, which we start to do something about, but between osteopaths individually, which we need to do something more with, but also between osteopaths and the rest of health. We are part of the health market. We are not the panacea for all the nation's health. And I think if we agree that, we're going to start to move forward a lot quicker. What's holding us back? These are some of the conclusions that the strategy workshop in January came up with. So these are issues which we need to deal with that are holding us back from achieving that sort of long-term vision. Identity and cohesion. Are we one profession, or are we visceral versus cranial versus structural versus, why is a collective noun for osteopaths a disagreement? Why, when there are 10 osteopaths in the room, you have 11 different opinions of what to do next, including dinner. So, can we start to actually adopt a single, clear brand identity? Engagement in broad health. It's not about throwing us in the arms of the NHS, but unless doctors, nurses, and surgeons understand what we do, they're not going to understand what we do, and therefore they're not going to refer, they're not going to want to work with us. Public awareness and understanding. That's what's holding back the 90% who have not yet ever used an osteopath. Some of the work done by GEOSC, a couple of years ago suggested that if you were not a patient, a current patient, your propensity, your willingness, your desire to learn about an osteopath is pretty low. We want useful and practical supportive information and evidence. Not RCTs, but we actually need to use perhaps the evidence that we've got better, inform better, use it in an educational way. We need career opportunities and structure, and we need more coherent working between all our organizations within osteopathy. So, this is just a fairly simple blob map, there's probably other ways of describing it, of the IO strategy for the next 5 years. And the IO strategy for the next 5 years is purely the first step in starting to address those challenges. Starting from the top, we aim to develop common strategies with all the other osteopathic stakeholders, because we still don't do that. We know we can work together, ODG is proving that, but we'd now like to work with COE, the UCO as an organization, just pointing you out, all others to actually develop a coherent, cohesive strategy that we can all have a part of, because that's how we're going to go faster. We need good, usable evidence. Thank you to NCORE, thank you to our international colleagues in COMI, across the pond, across the channel. There's lots of good stuff coming out. Let's filter and let's engage with that evidence and present it in a way that's understandable to a variety of audiences. We want a range of careers. We want a broad range of careers. We want to extend career choice, as opposed to just coming out of your college, buying a slate and sticking it to a wall. We're going to invest at least 50 or 60 grand in the project called Brand Osteopath, which I must admit was an idea first triggered by Jonathan when he first came, and I think about 2-3 months he said, I have no idea how you guys do it, but the outcome of an osteopath sounds pretty damn amazing. It's a black box. So this is the black box approach. Let's not worry too much about what's inside the box, which is all that is around osteopathic philosophy, thinking, technique, Let's worry about actually what the patient thinks about the outside, which is what the outcome, what benefits you actually bring. And the benefit is not just as simple as relief from pain. It's about mobility, increased function, all the stuff that you know you deliver. But let's try and grab that in patient language. Let's understand what the patients think of us. We're going to educate the public more. It's not therefore just about defining a brand positioning and pushing it hard. To support it, we actually need to use the evidence that we're collecting in another box and actually throwing it out in a way that is convincing and easy to assess. Susan Farwell is actually going to be leading a program which at the moment has a code name of Project Compendium, which is about taking evidence-informed practice and actually basically wrapping it into a sun language and easily accessible way of communicating with the public, because we need the public to understand what we do. We need to continue to engage with the rest of health. We now not only have a lot of Matthew, we have a policy officer who's dedicated, Sarah, not just the policy officer, but who's dedicated to actually getting inside all our stakeholders within health, learning what they need, and actually starting to build real working relations. And last but not at all least, working closely with members. We'd like you to work with us. We want to understand more and more about how you think, how you behave, how you want to behave, and what your options of the future are. Because we need to address those. Otherwise, we're not big enough to do everything for you, and we need to work together to deliver our future. We're going to start to communicate that process during a series of strategy roadshow events in spring next year. And that bottom half figure, by the way, is that IO Council also agreed, out of our reserves, to seed fund this new strategy to the tune of £250,000. So the IO is going to go into a trading loss for the next 3 years and spend that amount of money in developing a brand, promoting osteopathy, understanding and developing research, and educating the public. Does that sound good? Cool. Right, I'm now going to save 3,000 words by showing you 3 pictures. We are not alone. We are not alone because we are part of the big health market. Second picture. We do not want to be alone. Falling in... No, I won't sing. And thirdly, this is, to me, the next 25 years. We've got to learn together, work together to make our new future, to make that vision that we pointed out that you guys seem to be in agreement with. Thank you.
So we'd like to hear from you now, but also we'd like to hear from you during the coming year. We'd like you to bend the ears of the council members. We'd like you to ring up Morris and nag him. We'd like you to use the IO as a resource. We're here for you all. We're here for the profession. And we'd like you to encourage other people who are maybe not members of the IO to use us as a resource, and because there's a lot of shared experience and resource. Okay, question.
Yeah, I just wondered about the student numbers, because certainly I've just finished at Swansea, and Swansea's gone from my cohort, which I think was 20, to a cohort, I think their latest cohort is 40. So is that obviously not being reflected in other institutions, or is it particular institutions that are losing out?
It's just an overall number that we're reporting at the moment. I mean, individually by college, there will be variances. But yes, there has been a downward trend over the last couple of years, which is what we need to take very seriously, basically.
Thinking about take-home messages, how are we going to make it work? What do we need to do? There's been a lot of input today. What do you all think about this? What do we hear back from you? We have a stunned audience.
Hello, thank you. I think the branding idea is a really good idea. I think just to get a really clear brand of what we are and what we do, I think that's a really good place to start to get so that people kind of understand where we're going. So I really very much like that idea.
Thank you. I think I'm rather proud of listening to the panel about branding and something Simon mentioned earlier about 1993. And of course, I saw that, and it's taken a long time for Morris now to come up with this branding business, so well done. But I'm not really going to bend his ears, but I just wanted to know too, along with branding, in keeping working together with educators such as Charles Hunt, I know in our profession we have spoken about career ladder. Is that something that the panel have thought through or discussing it, and together with the branding, of course? I know some of the colleagues given the title honorary professorship, so.
Can I comment that part of the AHP challenge is to look into the opportunities that there are, because they need us. And for young new graduates coming out, there are set up opportunities for people to work within the system. And this is a huge opportunity that we should explore for the benefit of new graduates who need to establish a career. So that's a big part we haven't even properly explored yet. And Linda this morning was pointing to lots of resources on the website, which I don't know about yet. But I see that as a big part of it, a rather unknown map.
Career development is not an end in itself. I think there's an observation that you can't stand still. People, if they're just doing the same thing year upon year, most people will eventually get bored. So it's what do you do next? Now, if you're coming in at the age of 40 and you're seeing it as a downshift, that's one thing. If you're in at the age of 25 then by the time you've done 35, you've done the basics. So it's what do you do next? How do you keep the momentum going? How do you keep it interested and stop them getting bored? So it's that sort of thing that also drives, so that's career development, plus of course the self-improvement, clinically things don't stay the same. So there's something around self-directed learning, which is also important to keep going. All those things need driving to keep the profession dynamic and moving.
This is the point, because in a hospital setting, it's easily done. You can see the model, consultancy and so on. Whereas with us, once we're qualified, that's it, we're on our own. And of course, that probably in the end will go in hand with this branding, this recognition, this promotion of osteopathy and so on.
Yep.
I'm just curious if the panel or some colleagues of ours in the profession have been thinking through this. If so, what type of models it will be? And
certainly part of what we're working on at the moment through our contacts with NHS England are we're starting to understand the sort of gap of either skills, actually in mainly it's experience rather than skills, that is stopping, for example, osteopaths easily accessing NHS jobs or other roles. And we will be working with the colleges to put programs together to actually fix those. I mean, and it is not just about opening up opportunities. We also have to work with colleges and others to provide the mechanisms in which osteopaths can actually access them. Actually, by the way, there's a massive demand for in NHS England for AHP leaders, which I actually thought would be fantastic for anyone who's the second careerist who really already has 10 years experience in management in the commercial world, because that's what they're looking for. They actually want people with an AHP view of health who wants to run bits of the NHS. So there are those jobs going. They are desperate for it already.
sorry, what is HB? Sorry.
Allied health professional.
Pardon, sorry. Thank you.
Okay, we're running over time now, so you all need a drink, I'm sure. Do we have one more? Let's hear from Duncan.
Thank you. Part of the problem lies within the NHS itself, of course, because at one end you've got the lady in Essex who wants to get more osteopaths. At the other end you've got clinical commissioning groups who arbitrarily decide that osteopathy as a whole is a procedure of limited clinical value. And in the middle you've got quite a lot of not knowing and not particularly caring. And one of the real uphill challenges is to actually influence that vast organisation that the NHS is to alter its thinking a bit. And what you were saying, involving osteopaths' backgrounds in management does have a very striking effect in organisations. I mean, when I worked in Hospital Trust and was on the board there, one of the best clinical directors we had in one of our directorates was actually a pharmacist, and he wasn't the clinical director of pharmacy and that sort of activity. I think he was actually running musculoskeletal because he was a very good person who knew how to organise. And getting a little bit of a foothold in some of those positions is quite important to changing the range of apathy through to enthusiasm that you've got in the NHS.
So just a quick response, which is that absolutely, and this is where I think we and the members need to work much more closely. Because actually influencing and changing those attitudes is something that we need to do at multiple levels. Yes, we are talking to Health Education England, Public Health England, NHS England, all that great stuff. So we're trying to change the rules under which we're allowed to play, and my God, have they changed in the last 18 months. But actually at the same time, they need osteopaths to go and bug them at local level. There are AHP hubs, there are research hubs, there are local groups which actually encourage all AHPs to come together to talk to the doctors and nurses and other folk. Please get engaged. The other thing I would really exhort you to do is you guys are on site, and thank you, but actually about a third of the community isn't yet. Can you please drag them kicking and screaming into membership? Because we don't often need them. But, it's working together. Go and work with another osteopath too.
So, thank you all for being here. thank you all for being part of the day. Thank you very much, Simon Fielding and Jonathan Shapiro and Maurice Cheng. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.